Hello, everyone. Today, we're going to step into a room that feels colder than it should be. The curtains are drawn, the air is still, and all you can hear is the quiet shuffle of papers being prepared by a lawyer who looks far too calm for the storm about to begin. There is no sound of laughter, no small talk, just the heavy, expectant silence of people waiting to see who will walk away with everything and who will leave with nothing. I'm sitting at the edge of the long oak table. My hands are steady, though inside me there is a weight pressing down on every breath. Across from me sit the faces I once knew so well, my own family, the ones I raised, loved, and sacrificed for. Their eyes avoid mine, darting instead toward the sealed envelope in the lawyer's hand, as if my presence no longer matters, as if I am already erased. This isn't just a reading of a will, it's the unveiling of a battlefield. Behind the stillness, hearts are pounding, hopes are clashing, and greed is whispering its poison into ears. You can feel it in the air, the way some lean forward, the way others cross their arms, pretending not to care, but aching to hear their name tied to wealth, to property, to legacy. And then, there is my son. My own blood. He does not look at me. His jaw is tight, his gaze fixed on the lawyer, and in that moment, I realize he has already chosen sides. Not with me. Not with the mother who carried him through sickness, through poverty, through nights of hunger and fear. He has chosen himself. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time of day is it for you right now? Because as you listen to this story, I want you to remember the setting you're in, the place you're safe, while I take you into a place where safety was no longer guaranteed. The lawyer clears his throat, a sound so small, yet it feels like thunder rolling across the room. Papers unfold. Names are read. My name is there, tied to everything I've worked for, everything I thought would be passed down with love. But just as quickly as the words are spoken, they are shattered. He rises. My son. His voice is sharp, unforgiving, carrying an authority he does not deserve. Erase her name, he says. She's not one of us. The world tilts. My vision narrows. For a moment, I cannot breathe. These are not the words of a stranger. They are the words of the child I gave my life to raise. And with those words, he cuts deeper than any blade could. I look around the table, searching for someone, anyone, to speak up, to defend me. But silence answers back. Silence. And the sound of my own heart breaking in a room that was once supposed to hold family, love, and trust. This is where the story begins. The silence that followed his words was unlike anything I had ever felt before. It wasn't the silence of peace or of reflection. It was heavy, almost physical, pressing against my chest until it hurt to draw breath. The kind of silence that doesn't allow you to hide, the kind that makes every detail around you sharper. The tick of the clock on the wall, the faint hum of the air conditioner, the nervous shifting of chairs on polished wooden floors. I sat frozen, my hands resting flat on the table, palms burning against the varnished oak. The lawyer cleared his throat again, hesitant now, as though he too had not expected the sudden eruption. His eyes darted toward me, then away, searching for the proper, professional words to break the unbearable stillness. But words failed him. Words failed everyone, because in that moment, the silence was louder than any scream could ever be. I turned my gaze to my son. He stood tall, shoulders squared, eyes fixed ahead, as though he had delivered a verdict, and nothing, least of all his mother's heart, could alter it. His face was not angry, not red with passion, not trembling with emotion. It was calm, cold, as if he had practiced this moment in his mind many times before. And that realization struck me harder than the words themselves. He had been waiting for this, preparing for this. He hadn't spoken in impulse or rage. He had chosen this moment, here, in front of everyone, to erase me. The silence gave him power. No one interrupted, no one rebuked him. His siblings, my other children, sat in stunned stillness. Some looked down at their hands, unwilling to meet my eyes. Others stared at the floor, at the lawyer's papers, anywhere but at me. As if by refusing to look, they could pretend they were not complicit. My throat burned. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to cry out, "Do you not remember who I am? Do you not recall every sacrifice, every night I spent awake when you were sick, every meal I gave up so you could eat?" But the words tangled inside me, strangled by the weight of humiliation. Because in that instant, I realized, perhaps they did remember. Perhaps that was what made it easier to dismiss me. Convenience, not love, had been my role. The lawyer finally spoke, his voice faltering. "Mr. Thompson, please, let's keep order. This is a legal proceeding, not—" But my son cut him off, voice rising now, sharpened by the silence. "It matters. She doesn't belong here. She's not family." Not family. Two words that struck deeper than any insult. Two words that erased decades of motherhood in an instant. My ears rang, and yet every detail of the room seared into my memory. The lawyer's trembling hands, the way one niece gasped softly, the glint of the chandelier above, reflecting in crystal glasses that no one dared touch. Still, no one defended me. That silence spoke louder than any verdict. It said, "He is right. We accept it. You are alone." The lawyer shuffled his papers nervously, pressing forward as though by clinging to routine, he might salvage dignity from this wreckage. He read clauses aloud, names assigned to properties, savings, heirlooms. Each sentence was mechanical, but every syllable carried weight. And with each name spoken, I felt myself shrinking further from the family I had built with my own hands. Occasionally, I heard sharp intakes of breath, someone pleased with what they received, someone else bristling at being overlooked. But beneath it all lay that same suffocating silence about me. The silence of absence, the silence of agreement with his words. I found myself gripping the edge of the table. My nails dug into the wood. I thought of rising, of storming out, of screaming the truth until the walls themselves echoed with my pain. But I remained seated, frozen, because walking out would mean surrender. Staying meant enduring, and I did not yet know which was worse. The silence grew unbearable. It expanded until it became something alive in the room, coiling between us, pressing on our lungs. A silence born not of shock anymore, but of choice. They had chosen not to speak, chosen not to defend, chosen to let me stand alone. I thought of the nights I had tucked him into bed, of the lullabies I sang when storms rattled the windows. I thought of his small hand clutching mine on the way to school, of the way his eyes once lit up when I walked into a room. Those memories rose like ghosts around me, whispering in the silence, asking, "Where did it all go wrong?" But ghosts cannot answer. When the reading concluded, the lawyer closed the folder with a soft thud. It was the loudest sound in the room, second only to my son's cruel declaration. He looked around, waiting for anyone to rise, to move, to signal that the proceeding was over. No one moved, because the silence wasn't done yet. It clung to me, to them, to the very walls of that room. The silence was not the absence of noise. It was the presence of judgment, the weight of betrayal. It was my family agreeing, without words, that I no longer belonged. And in that silence, something inside me broke. His words didn't just fall into the room. They cut through it like a blade. "Erase her name. She's not one of us." The echo seemed to linger in the air long after his lips closed, as though the walls themselves wanted to remember, to etch the cruelty into stone, so no one could ever deny it had been said. For a long moment, I sat motionless, staring at him. I wanted to believe I had misheard, that perhaps he had spoken out of confusion or shock, that some strange misunderstanding would reveal itself and unravel the sting. But no. He stood tall, his voice steady, his eyes cold, and his mouth set in the grim line of conviction. There was no mistake. My son had meant every word. I remember thinking, almost absurdly, how strange it was that a sentence so short could dismantle an entire lifetime, that 8 words could wipe away years of sacrifice, years of sleepless nights, years of standing between him and the world. 8 words, sharpened by bitterness, poisoned by greed, and delivered without a flicker of hesitation. He did not look at me as he said it. His gaze was locked on the lawyer, as though I was not worth acknowledging, as though I had already ceased to exist. That, more than the words themselves, was what gutted me. To be dismissed not with rage, but with indifference, to be erased without even the courtesy of eye contact. The silence that followed seemed to deepen. No one dared challenge him. My other children shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, eyes flicking between him and me, but their lips remained sealed. Their fear, or perhaps their agreement, was a weight pressing down on my chest. I wanted to scream at them, say something, defend me, remind him of who I am, of what I've done for all of you. But no one spoke, and so the only sound was the echo of his cruelty, still rattling in my ears. I could feel the blood pounding in my temples, my hands trembling against the table. I tried to gather air into my lungs, but it felt as if the room itself was closing in. My throat burned with words I couldn't force out, because if I opened my mouth, I wasn't sure if I would speak or sob. I studied his face, searching desperately for the boy I once knew. The boy who had clutched my hand when he was afraid of thunderstorms. The boy who used to press drawings into my lap with shy pride. The boy whose smile could light up my darkest days. But that boy was gone. In his place stood a man hardened by greed, or resentment, or something even darker that I couldn't name. He wanted me erased. The lawyer looked from him to me, helpless. His duty was to the will, to the law, but even he could not ignore the venom hanging in the air. He opened his mouth as though to remind us all of legal procedure, but my son raised a hand, silencing him. "This isn't just about paperwork," he said, his voice even firmer now. "It's about truth. She doesn't belong." Truth. The word twisted like a knife. What truth? The truth that I carried him in my body for 9 long months? That I worked 3 jobs to put food on the table? That I gave up friendships, dreams, and any chance of an easy life so he could have more than I ever did? If that wasn't belonging, then what was? My heart screamed the answers, but my lips remained still. Because I knew that no amount of pleading could undo the choice he had made in that moment. He wasn't searching for truth. He was rewriting it. And yet, as much as I wanted to collapse under the weight of his words, something inside me began to shift. The cruelty, sharp and undeniable, carved out a hollow space where love had once resided. Into that space, something unexpected crept. Clarity. Painful clarity, but clarity nonetheless. For years, I had blinded myself to the cracks, telling myself that every cold glance, every dismissive word, every manipulation was just stress, just circumstance, just temporary distance. I convinced myself that love was still there, buried beneath layers of misunderstanding. But in that moment, with those words, the veil was torn away. This was not misunderstanding. This was choice, and it wasn't new. The cruelty had been building, brick by brick, over years of quiet betrayals. I just hadn't wanted to see it. My fingers tightened against the table as I realized this was not just about inheritance. This was about power. He wanted to claim everything, not just the money, not just the property, but the narrative of our family. He wanted to paint me as the outsider, the unwanted, so that he could stand taller in the ashes of what once was. I felt the eyes of the others on me, some curious, some pitying, some perhaps relieved it wasn't them in my place. Their silence was another betrayal, but my focus remained on him, on the son who once needed me more than air, now declaring me a stranger. I wanted to ask him why. I wanted to demand an explanation, to understand the depth of the wound that could lead him here. But I knew, even as the urge burned in my chest, that no answer would heal what had just been broken. His words were not a lapse of judgment. They were a declaration of war. The lawyer finally stammered forward, reminding everyone that the will could not simply be altered by personal protest. That legality did not bend to anger. But even as he spoke, I could tell. The damage was done. Whether the ink on the paper acknowledged it or not, my son had already erased me in his heart. And that erasure was more final than any legal document could ever be. The cruel words lingered in the room, circling like vultures. And in that silence, in that unbearable space between his hatred and my heartbreak, I understood something I had never dared admit before. I had lost him. When words wound so deeply in the present, the mind cannot help but retreat into the past. Sitting there, with his cruelty echoing in my chest, I found myself drifting back to a time when his voice was small, when his words were innocent, when I was his entire world. It is strange how memory works. One moment, I was staring at a grown man disowning me, and the next, I was standing in a dim apartment decades earlier, cradling him in my arms. His tiny body was feverish, his breaths shallow, and I remember rocking him through the night, whispering lullabies I made up on the spot, desperate for him to find comfort. I had no one to call, no partner to lean on, no money for a doctor's visit. Just me and him, and the fear that if I closed my eyes, even for a second, I might lose him. I remember the hunger, not his, mine. The countless nights when I pretended I was full, so he would eat the last of the rice or the final piece of bread. I told him stories at the dinner table, distracting him from how little there was, making him laugh while my stomach twisted in silence. I remember birthdays when there was no money for toys. So I made them myself. I carved little wooden cars from scraps, stitched stuffed animals from old clothes. His face would light up as though I had handed him treasures from the richest kingdom. He would hug me tight, whispering, "Thank you, Mom," with a sincerity that melted every hardship into joy. And school. How could I forget school? The hours I worked, cleaning houses, scrubbing floors, taking any job I could, to afford his uniforms, his books, his lunches. There were mornings when I sent him off with polished shoes, though mine were falling apart at the seams. Afternoons when I sat at the kitchen table helping him with homework, even though my own eyes burned from exhaustion. Every A he brought home felt like a victory, not just for him, but for both of us. The sacrifices multiplied as he grew. I remember pawning my wedding ring to cover a medical bill, selling the last of my jewelry to help him join a sports team he begged to be part of, working double shifts to make sure he never felt the shame of going without. Each choice was easy then, because love made it so. I never thought of them as losses. They were investments. In him, in his future, in the life I dreamed he would have. And when life tested us, I was his shield. I stood between him and bullies at school, between him and the harsh whispers of neighbors who judged a boy without a father. I was his defender, his advocate, his constant. When he cried, I wiped his tears. When he stumbled, I lifted him. When he doubted himself, I reminded him of his strength. I think now of the nights when he was sick with the flu, his forehead burning, his small hand clutching mine as though it were the only anchor in a storm. I whispered promises then, promises that I would never leave him, that I would always fight for him, that nothing in this world could sever the bond between us. How cruel, then, to sit in that room and hear him sever it himself. The memories played like film reels, sharper and brighter against the darkness of his betrayal. I remembered the Christmas when I stayed up until dawn, assembling a second-hand bicycle so he could find it waiting under the tree. The tears in his eyes as he rode it down the street, the pride in his voice when he told neighbors, "My mom got me this." Where had that pride gone? At what point had it turned into disdain? Perhaps it began when I said yes too often, when I gave and gave until giving became expected, not cherished, when help turned into habit and habit into entitlement. I taught him that love meant sacrifice, but perhaps he learned the wrong lesson, that sacrifice was endless, that it required nothing in return. I thought of the years I spent working so he could go to college, even when the cost nearly broke me. The day he graduated, I clapped the loudest, tears streaming down my face, certain my sacrifices had been worth it. He hugged me in his gown and cap, whispered, "I couldn't have done this without you." I believed him. I cherished those words. Now I see them for what they were, a momentary acknowledgement, fleeting as smoke. And yet, even as the memories cut, they also reminded me of something else. I had loved him fully, with everything I had. That love was real. It was the truest thing I had ever given. His betrayal could not erase the fact that I had once been his everything. Still, the sting lingered. Because sacrifices, when remembered, are supposed to be honored. They are supposed to be the bedrock of gratitude. But in that room, they meant nothing. The years I gave away, the dreams I buried, the countless nights of exhaustion, all of it swept aside with a single sentence. She's not one of us. I closed my eyes, letting the tide of memory crash over me. I could hear the echo of his childhood laughter, the soft patter of his feet running down the hall, the way he used to call my name when he needed comfort. And then, overlaying it all, his adult voice, cold, sharp, merciless. Erase her name. The boy I raised was gone. In his place was a man who saw me not as a mother, but as an obstacle. And the cruelest part? Every memory of sacrifice only deepened the wound, because they proved just how much I had given to someone who now wanted me erased. I opened my eyes. The room had not changed. The silence still held, heavy as before. But within me, a storm had begun. Not just of pain, but of clarity. If he could forget all that I had done, then perhaps it was time for me to remember what I had lost in giving it all away. Families are supposed to be bound by blood, by love, by history. At least, that is what I told myself for years. But as I sat there, the will lying open on the table, my son's words hanging heavy in the air, I realized something harsher. Families are also divided by choice, and the choices were happening right before my eyes. At first, it was subtle, the way my eldest daughter looked down, refusing to meet my gaze. The way my younger son shifted in his seat, rubbing his hands together nervously, as though calculating whether silence was safer than truth. The way one of the cousins leaned slightly closer to my son, his posture a quiet signal of alliance. None of them spoke, but their silence was not neutral. It was a decision. The lawyer tried to proceed, his voice quivering as he read the clauses of the will. Properties, accounts, heirlooms, all neatly written in legal ink. Yet with every line, tension rippled through the room like electricity. One relative smiled faintly when their name was read. Another frowned when the distribution wasn't to their liking. And all the while, my son remained standing, looming like a judge over the rest of us, his words still echoing in the silence. Erase her name. The division began to harden. Some leaned toward him, not with words, but with their silence and their eyes, as if he had spoken what they had secretly thought but dared not say. Others sat stiffly, their discomfort evident, their loyalty wavering but unspoken. No one dared to challenge him outright. To challenge him would be to risk being cut off themselves. I felt the weight of every stare, every avoided glance. The family I had built with sweat and sacrifice was cracking apart, and the inheritance was the hammer. It is astonishing how quickly greed reshapes loyalty. One daughter, who used to call me for advice on everything from recipes to heartbreak, now sat with her arms crossed, lips pressed thin, as if she had decided to keep her distance. My younger brother, who once swore to stand by me through anything, cleared his throat as though to speak in my defense, but then stopped, lowering his eyes, retreating into safety. The betrayal was quiet, almost invisible, but I could feel it in my bones. The lawyer's words blurred. I heard numbers, dates, percentages, but they meant little to me. What mattered was the shifting of faces, the widening cracks. For years, I had believed we were united, scarred, imperfect, but united. Now I saw the truth. We had been bound not by love, but by convenience. Bound by what I could provide, by what they stood to gain, by the expectation that I would always give more than I took. And now that giving was in question. Now that I was no longer a guaranteed source of sacrifice, their true allegiances emerged. My son pressed his advantage. He leaned forward, his voice lower but no less sharp. She doesn't belong here. You all know it. She gave what she wanted to give, but she doesn't deserve what's left. This legacy is ours. Ours. The word twisted in my gut. Who was included in that ours? Him, certainly. Perhaps the daughter who sat in silence, afraid to contradict him. Perhaps the cousin who nodded faintly, eyes gleaming at the thought of a larger share. But not me. Never me. The inheritance had become a weapon, a line drawn in the sand. On one side stood those willing to erase me for gain. On the other side, silence. Not defense, not courage. Just silence. And silence, in moments like these, was as cruel as betrayal. I thought of family gatherings from years past. Birthdays where laughter filled the air, holidays where we crowded around the table, fighting for space and stealing bites of food before the meal was served. I thought of the photos we took, smiles wide, arms around each other, convinced we were unbreakable. Those memories felt like lies now. Or perhaps they had always been fragile, and I was only just now seeing the truth. What pained me most was not the greed. Greed is predictable. It was the ease with which they allowed division to grow, the way they slipped into silence, as though loyalty were too costly. It was the realization that love had always been conditional, dependent on what I could give, never on who I was. The lawyer finally paused, his eyes flicking nervously toward me. "Do you wish to respond?" he asked softly, as if offering me a chance to salvage dignity. But before I could open my mouth, my son cut in. "There's nothing to respond to. We all know the truth. She was useful, that's all. Now she's finished." A few eyes widened at his bluntness, but still, no one spoke against him. The division was complete now. Those who quietly aligned with him, those who hid behind silence, and me, left utterly alone. I sat back in my chair, my breath slow, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. The words stung, yes. The betrayal burned, yes. But beneath it all, a new realization settled in my chest. This was not the destruction of my family. It was the revelation of what had always been. The inheritance had not divided us. It had exposed us. And though my heart ached with every beat, I understood something vital in that moment. What was being destroyed here was not me. It was the illusion I had carried all my life, that blood alone is enough to guarantee love. The room buzzed faintly now with side conversations, whispers about money, about property, about who deserved what. My son smirked, satisfied with his dominance. And I sat in silence, no longer trying to fight the division, but watching it unfold with a clarity I had never allowed myself before. Greed has a way of creeping in quietly, like a shadow slipping under the door. At first, you don't notice it. A glance here, a whisper there. But then it grows, stretching longer, darker, until it consumes the room. That was what happened after the reading of the will. What should have been a moment of remembrance, of honoring a life and a legacy, became instead a marketplace. Silent, tense, but no less ruthless. I watched it unfold in the small, telling gestures. The way one niece leaned over to another, lips barely moving, eyes darting toward the mention of property in the countryside. The way my brother's hand twitched at the sound of certain numbers, his jaw tightening in calculation. The way my daughter adjusted her posture, sitting straighter, as though she wanted to appear stronger, more deserving in the lawyer's eyes. Greed spoke in these silent languages long before it ever took words. And then, of course, there were the words. "Was that amount correct?" someone asked, their tone dripping with suspicion. "I thought the house was to be split evenly," another chimed in, pretending to ask for clarification, but betraying the edge of anger beneath. "What about the jewelry?" someone else muttered, as though heirlooms meant more than the memories attached to them. Greed does not shout, it hisses. It seeps into every syllable until love sounds like entitlement and family sounds like rivalry. I sat there, listening, almost detached, as though watching a play where I no longer belonged on the stage. My son had already erased me, but now I saw how easily others could erase one another. Blood did not matter here. History did not matter. What mattered was what each believed they were owed. What hurt was not just the greed itself, but how it reshaped the people I thought I knew. My daughter, once gentle, once the peacemaker in every conflict, now folded her arms, her eyes narrowing when the lawyer read a clause that favored her sibling. She didn't speak, not yet, but the silence around her was sharper than any accusation. My brother, who had once helped me carry groceries when I was too tired to lift them, now leaned forward, voice raised, demanding details about stocks and accounts he had never cared about before. Even the younger relatives, barely old enough to understand the weight of the inheritance, looked around with hungry eyes, already calculating futures built on what they might receive. Greed turned them all into strangers. I thought of past gatherings, of dinners filled with laughter, of birthdays where we crowded into one small kitchen, eating cake with our hands because plates ran out. Back then, love felt abundant, even when money was scarce. Now, with money on the table, love had vanished. Greed had stolen it in plain sight. And yet, what struck me most was how greed cloaked itself in justification. "I need this more than anyone else," one whispered, their voice trembling with the weight of self-pity. "She always had more than me. This is only fair," another muttered, convincing themselves that envy was justice. "It's what they would have wanted," someone else insisted, twisting memory into weapon. But I knew better. Greed does not care about fairness. It does not care about need. Greed only cares about itself. My son, still standing, watched it unfold with a smirk. He had started the fire, and now he warmed his hands by it. Every raised voice, every bitter whisper seemed to confirm his power. And no one dared to turn against him, not when they still hoped to gain. That was the cruelest part. Greed did not just divide us, it chained us to silence. No one defended me because they feared losing their share. No one challenged him because his approval meant protection. They had all become negotiators in a silent bargain, where loyalty was currency and betrayal was cheap. I felt a strange calm settle over me as I watched. The shock of his words had wounded me, yes, but now the truth unfolded more clearly than ever. This was not about me. This was about them. The people I thought I knew, the family I thought I belonged to. The inheritance had not changed them. It had revealed them. I wondered then how long greed had been with us. Had it been there when I gave money for their weddings, their homes, their emergencies? Had it been there in their thank yous, their promises to repay, their hugs that felt warm but perhaps were hollow? Had it been there in their silence when I needed them most, waiting for the day when my usefulness would run out? Greed does not arrive suddenly. It grows in secret, fed by envy, by entitlement, by years of taking without giving back. And now, in this room, it stood exposed for all to see. The lawyer had been struggling to maintain order, his voice drowned beneath the ripples of greed and the unspoken alliances forming around the table. At last, he raised his hand, firm yet trembling, and spoke with the kind of tone that demanded attention. "There are still parts of the will that must be read," he said. His eyes scanned the room, lingering on each of us as though to remind us of where we were. An office of law, not a marketplace of suspicion. But the air was too thick, the emotions too raw, for order to settle easily. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and opened another envelope. This one was smaller, thinner than the first, but the way his hands handled it carried a weight that made my heart tighten. "This portion," he explained, "was sealed separately. It contains specific instructions that must be honored." The room stilled. Even my son leaned forward slightly, curiosity breaking through his mask of control. The others quieted, greed temporarily tamed by the lure of mystery. The lawyer unfolded the paper slowly, deliberately. "It states here," he began, his voice careful, "that certain assets are to be withheld under conditions not previously disclosed." A murmur rippled across the table. I saw my daughter glance at her brother, her eyes wide with something between hope and fear. A cousin shifted in their chair, biting their lip as though calculating how this revelation might tilt the balance. The lawyer continued. It specifies that the family home, the house where many of you grew up, cannot be sold, transferred, or divided until— He paused, his eyes narrowing as he reread the line. Until the named matriarch passes away. My breath caught. The matriarch. That was me. For the first time since the reading began, the silence was no longer against me. It was against them. My son's face darkened. His jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. He opened his mouth, then shut it again, struggling to compose himself. Around him, others exchanged quick glances, their expressions shifting from anticipation to resentment. The house, our home, was mine, not theirs, and as long as I lived, it could not be touched. The lawyer pressed on, his voice gaining strength. Furthermore, it appears there is a clause specifying that certain accounts, those meant for the grandchildren, are to be placed in trust, protected from any interference by their parents. The funds will not be accessible until the children reach adulthood. Gasps escaped from more than one mouth. The implication was clear. My son and his wife, who had long relied on my generosity, would have no access to those funds. Their control was cut off, their expectations denied. My heart pounded as I processed the revelation. For years, I had given freely, pouring out everything I had for their benefit, never questioning, never demanding. And yet, the one who wrote this had seen the truth I had been too blind to face. They had known what I refused to admit, that greed corrodes, that some cannot be trusted with power, that protection must sometimes leap over a generation to save the next. I glanced at my grandchildren, too young to understand, too innocent to know the storm raging above their heads. They sat quietly, unaware that their futures had just been safeguarded. My chest ached with both relief and sorrow. Relief that they would have something untouched by manipulation. Sorrow that it took legal ink, not love, to secure it. The lawyer shifted again, his tone growing heavier. Lastly, he said, there is mention of a personal letter. It was written to be read aloud here, in this room, in the presence of all family members. A hush fell over the room, deeper than any silence before. My pulse raced. A letter. Words from the one who had left us this inheritance. Words they wanted us all to hear, not whispered in private, not hidden in envelopes, but declared before every set of eyes that now avoided mine. The lawyer unfolded the second sheet, older than the rest, its edges yellowed with time. His voice softened, though it did not waver. To my family, he read, I leave not only what I have earned, but what I have learned. I have seen love twisted into obligation, generosity turned into entitlement, and silence mistaken for respect. Let this will remind you, inheritance is not a prize to be claimed, but a reflection of values lived. Those who forget that will find wealth is no comfort for a fractured heart. No one breathed. The lawyer continued. To those who remember kindness, patience, and sacrifice, may you carry them forward. To those who chase only what they believe they are owed, may this inheritance teach you that true wealth is never money, but love. And if love is lost, then nothing gained will ever fill its place. The words settled over us like a heavy blanket. For a fleeting moment, I saw discomfort flicker across my son's face, though it vanished quickly, replaced again by defiance. He would not be moved by sentiment. Not now, perhaps not ever. But others shifted uneasily, the weight of the letter pressing on their consciences. I sat still, tears burning at the corners of my eyes. The letter was not mine, not written by my hand, but its truth felt aimed at me, for me, like a vindication I had never dared hope for. Someone else had seen. Someone else had known. The lawyer folded the papers carefully, returning them to the envelope. These are the final stipulations, he said, his voice quieter now. The rest will proceed according to the standard clauses. But no one heard the final words. All eyes were fixed on the table, on the invisible lines that had just been drawn by the will and the letter alike. The revelation had not healed us. It had not erased the cruelty or softened the greed, but it had exposed something undeniable. The legacy we carried was not just money, but the choices we would make with it. And already, I could see how those choices would divide us further. Betrayal rarely arrives without warning. It does not burst through the door suddenly, declaring itself. No, betrayal seeps in slowly, weaving itself into everyday life, hiding behind gestures of politeness and half smiles. Only when you look back do you realize it was there all along, waiting for the perfect moment to step into the light. That realization struck me as I sat in that room, the lawyer's words fading into the background, the letter's echo still humming in my heart. I began to notice things I had ignored before: gestures, glances, conversations whispered just low enough to escape notice. My son had not acted in impulse. His cruel words had not been a sudden storm. No, they were the final crack of thunder after a long gathering of clouds. I remembered, for instance, the hushed conversations I had overheard weeks earlier when I stopped by his house unexpectedly. He and his wife had been speaking in the kitchen, voices sharp, though muffled through the door. I caught fragments. "She'll expect too much. We need to handle it. Make sure it goes our way." At the time, I brushed it aside, convincing myself it was about something trivial. Now, their meaning cut clear. Plans were being laid. I remembered the way he had grown distant in recent years, no longer calling to check on me, no longer asking for advice. Conversations became rehearsed, stilted, as though he were reciting lines written by someone else. I had wanted to believe it was adulthood pulling him away, the natural separation between parent and child. But perhaps it had been preparation, a slow rewriting of his story, where I became a character he no longer needed. Even in the days leading up to the reading of the will, small betrayals had revealed themselves. His sudden insistence that I not attend certain family dinners, the way his wife avoided inviting me to birthday parties for my grandchildren, the strange tension in the air whenever money was mentioned, as though I were no longer a benefactor but a burden. The truth was clear now. Betrayal had been growing in plain sight, nurtured by greed, whispered behind doors, and silently agreed upon in family gatherings where my absence was the only thing celebrated. As I sat there, I began to overhear more. To my left, my niece leaned toward her brother, whispering, "If she steps back, we might gain more." He said so. To my right, my daughter muttered something about how it would be easier if things were divided differently. They didn't lower their voices enough to hide the intent, because they didn't need to. They assumed my silence was surrender. And perhaps, until that moment, it had been. I let their words pierce me, not with shock, but with clarity. They had not waited for the lawyer's reading to decide where they stood. The betrayal had already taken root. They had been preparing, aligning themselves, calculating. This gathering was not a revelation, it was confirmation. I thought of the family dinners, where I felt a strange chill, as though conversations paused when I entered the room. I thought of the sudden excuses when I asked to see the children, the way doors closed just as I walked down the hall. Those were not accidents. They were rehearsals. And in that room, in front of me, they no longer bothered to hide it. Betrayal was spoken openly, eyes darting not with shame, but with eagerness. My son had given them permission to strip away the masks, to reveal what they had long been practicing in whispers. I was not family, I was a resource, and resources, once depleted, are discarded. The lawyer, sensing the rising tension, tried to move us forward, but even his voice could not cover the betrayal now buzzing around the table. People spoke in half-sentences, muttered agreements, subtle nods. The alliances were forming openly, as though I were invisible, as though I had already been erased. It was strange, almost surreal, to sit there and watch the people I loved dismantle everything we once stood for. I had imagined betrayal as a violent act, a dramatic confrontation. But here it was, quiet, methodical, unfolding in plain sight. And somehow, that made it even crueler. Because betrayal, when it hides, still acknowledges the bond it breaks. But when betrayal walks boldly into the light, it means the bond is already dead. I studied their faces one by one. My son, smirking faintly, confident in his victory. My daughter, biting her lip, torn but unwilling to stand for me. My brother, calculating, his eyes darting between the lawyer's papers and the others, weighing his advantage. Cousins, nieces, nephews, all caught in the gravity of greed, their loyalty slipping like sand through open fingers. Not one met my eyes. And in that moment, I felt something unexpected. Not just grief, not just anger, but release. Because to see betrayal in plain sight is to finally stop pretending. I no longer needed to tell myself stories about family unity, about love unbreakable. The truth was in front of me, undeniable. They had betrayed me, and perhaps they had betrayed themselves even more. The lawyer, trying desperately to maintain formality, asked if anyone wished to make further comments. My son leaned forward, his voice steady, as though sealing the betrayal with finality. "We all know what's fair. Some people just don't belong anymore." The words hung there, almost casual, as though fairness had ever been part of the conversation. I didn't respond. Not yet, because I understood now. Betrayal doesn't always demand an immediate fight. Sometimes it demands patience. Sometimes the truest power lies not in shouting back, but in letting their betrayal expose them for what they are. And so I sat quietly, the whispers swirling around me, the betrayal unfolding in plain sight. My heart ached, yes, but for the first time, I saw clearly. I was not losing my family in that moment. I had lost them long ago, and finally, I was ready to stop pretending otherwise. When the reading finally ended, and the lawyer closed the folder, with an exhausted sigh, the family dispersed like fragments of glass after a shattering. Some slipped out quietly, their heads down, avoiding my gaze. Others clustered together in corners, whispering, planning, already discussing what came next. My son walked out with his chest high, his arm around his wife, their voices low but triumphant. And I was left sitting at that long oak table, my reflection caught faintly in the polished surface. The room emptied, but the silence remained, wrapping itself around me tighter than ever. I had always believed isolation was something to fear. The absence of family, the absence of love, that was the nightmare I had worked my whole life to avoid. I built my days around their needs, my choices around their happiness, because I thought belonging meant never being alone. But now, alone in that room, I realized the cruelest truth. I had been isolated long before this day. They had left me piece by piece, year after year, until all that remained was the illusion of closeness. I had clung to that illusion so tightly, I didn't notice the silence growing in its place. Walking out of the lawyer's office, the air outside felt sharp, almost punishing. The sun was bright, but it burned against my skin rather than warming it. I stood on the steps, watching them scatter in different directions, not one of them pausing to look back. Not one. I wanted to cry, to collapse under the weight of their absence, but the tears refused to come. Instead, I felt a hollow stillness inside me, as though grief had burned itself out, leaving only ashes. In the days that followed, isolation became my shadow. Phone calls that once came regularly stopped. Friends who had always seemed loyal grew quiet, hesitant to get involved. Even neighbors, who used to wave cheerfully from their porches, seemed to watch me with wary eyes, unsure of what story they had heard, unsure of whether it was safe to show kindness. I had become invisible. And yet, strangely, in that invisibility, something began to shift. Because in the stillness of isolation, I started to hear my own voice again. It was faint at first, trembling like a candle in the wind. But it was there, whispering truths I had long ignored. It told me that I had spent too many years defining myself through them, through their needs, their demands, their endless expectations. It told me that my worth was not measured by how much I gave away, nor by how many sacrifices I stacked on my shoulders. In the quiet of an empty house, I began to remember who I was before I became only mother, provider, caretaker. I remembered the young woman who once dreamed of traveling, of painting, of writing letters to herself in notebooks she never showed anyone. I remembered laughter that was not tied to obligation, joy that was not dependent on approval. And slowly, in that loneliness, I began to reclaim fragments of that woman. The first step was small. I cooked a meal only for myself. For years, I had measured ingredients by the needs of others, stretching food to fill hungry mouths. Now, I seasoned the dish the way I liked it, plated it carefully, and sat at the table alone. The silence was strange, but it wasn't cruel. It was mine. The next step came when I opened an old sketchbook, tucked away in a drawer. The pages were yellowed, the drawings faint, but my hand remembered. The pencil moved, hesitant at first, then freer. Hours slipped by, and for the first time in years, I lost myself in creation rather than obligation. Isolation, I realized, was not just emptiness. It was also space. Space to breathe, to rediscover, to rebuild. But resolve did not come easily. There were nights when the weight of betrayal crushed me, when I lay awake hearing his words replay over and over. Erase her name. She's not one of us. There were mornings when I stared at the phone, willing it to ring, knowing it would not. Loneliness still cut deep, but in its sharpness, I found a kind of honesty. It forced me to face what I had avoided for too long. I could not control their choices. I could only control my own. And so, I began to choose differently. I stopped waiting by the phone. I stopped rehearsing speeches in my head, trying to imagine what I might say to change his mind, to soften his heart. I stopped bending myself into smaller shapes just to fit into their shrinking definition of family. Instead, I chose dignity. Dignity in silence, when responding would only fuel their cruelty. Dignity in walking past neighbors without shrinking under their gaze. Dignity in claiming my own time, my own joy, without apology. The more I leaned into that resolve, the lighter I began to feel. The grief was still there. It will always be there, but it no longer defined every breath. Slowly, the ashes within me gave way to embers. Small, glowing, stubborn embers of strength. One afternoon, I sat in the garden, the sun warm on my face, the air carrying the scent of flowers I had planted long ago, but never had time to enjoy. For the first time, I felt no ache when I thought of the family inside my house, or rather, the house that used to feel like mine. I thought of them with a strange detachment, as though they were characters in a story I had finished reading. Their betrayal was the ending of that book. And now, I was free to begin another. Isolation had shown me its sharpest edges, but it had also revealed a hidden gift. Resolve. Resolve to no longer beg for love, to no longer trade dignity for scraps of attention, to no longer shrink in the face of silence. I was alone, but I was still here. And for the first time, that felt like enough.